Hello everyone, our lesson for this week will be about animal behaviors. Our objectives for this session will be to define what is a behavior, to identify the main types of behaviors, and to study the effect of the environment on animal behaviors. As you all know, a behavior is the way one acts towards others. It is the way an animal or person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus. You all remember that one of the main conditions to identify or to classify organisms is the response to stimuli. So whenever a stimulus appears, a response should be available. We can have many examples of responses. The image here shows that whenever a stimulus appears, we always have a response. The organism will do this response. In this image, you can see here that a lizard is laying on a rock in a sunny day. Actually, the lizard, whenever it feels cold, it lays on the rock in order to absorb heat from this rock. But whenever it feels hot, it goes to the shade. Another example is the production of saliva whenever you look to this picture. Whenever you look to not only for chocolate, whenever you look to any favorite food or any food that you find it tasty, the saliva will start producing. You should always remember that we have two types of stimuli. We have an internal stimulus that comes from inside your body, like when you feel hungry or thirsty, and this is actually a message from your body telling you that you have to drink water or you have to eat. Your stomach is sending this image. And we have an external stimulus that comes from outside the body, like whenever you feel hot or cold. Actually, it is a kind of a body regulation of temperature. Your body will regulate the temperature according to a change that occurs in the temperature, in the outside temperature. Now, we have learned that a behavior is a kind of a response done towards a stimulus. But actually, what influences a behavior? Actually, a behavior can be based on genetics. That means it can be transmitted by heredity, and this kind is called an innate behavior. We'll take an example, the personality or the anxiety that we could have. We do not learn how to have this behavior. Actually, we already have it. Or as shown in this figure, the male zebra, I'm going to zoom the picture. The male zebra finch bird starts singing when it is the mating season. Actually, this way of acting, it is done by an increase in the amount of testosterone available in blood. That's why it starts singing during the mating season. This is concerning the behavior that is influenced by genes. It can be transmitted from parents to offspring, from a generation to another one. The other type of behaviors is triggered by genes and environmental factors, not only genes, like learning how to cook, or like learning how to play football, or even like learning how to become a professional person in video games. This behavior is actually learned by experiences. Starting by the first type of behaviors, which is the innate behavior. As we have said, an innate behavior is genetically based. It does not depend on an experience. Like, for example, the flying process of bees. They do not learn how to fly. They already know how to fly. The swimming process of fish. They do not learn how to swim. The walking ability of humans. We do not learn how to walk. We actually have the ability to work. And for example, here it is a specific example of an innate behavior, which is when new hatched birds start stretching their necks and open their mouth when they see the parent coming toward the nest and holding food. This is a normal reaction. They actually do not get it by experience. They know how to do it. Actually, how could we know if a behavior is an innate or a learned behavior? We could know it if we watch a group of animals. When a group of animals have a common behavior, we can know directly that this behavior is innate, but it is not a learned behavior. We have the most known example in innate behavior is the fixed action pattern in some animals. As the name shows, the fixed action pattern is a set of actions that are repeated and are taken in the same order. The most known example is the pattern of rolling an egg out of the nest by a female goose. If we put an egg out of the nest of the female goose, the goose will start stretching its neck in order to start rolling back the egg to the nest. Even if we remove, you can see here in this image, even if we remove the egg, the goose will keep doing this pattern. This is a normal action. The goose will do it. The goose actually will continue performing this behavior even if we put another object which has the same shape of an egg. It will keep rolling it. For example, if we remove the egg and we put a small ball, the goose will continue performing this action. Another example of the fixed action pattern, it is the example of a newly hatched cuckoo bird. When the cuckoo birds lay eggs, they actually lay eggs in the nest of other bird species. When the eggs hatch, or when actually the first egg hatches, it pushes down all the other eggs out of the nest, even if eyes are not open yet. This behavior reminds us by a type of a symbiotic relationship that we have studied before. It is the brood parasitism. Now let's continue this is concerning the innate behavior. We have the fixed action pattern. Another example of behaviors, it is the learned behavior. As we have said, a learned behavior is a result of an interaction between an innate behavior, which is the ability, and experiences. For example, the ability to drive. We all have the ability to drive, but we all need an experience to become good drivers. That's what we mean by an interaction between an innate behavior and experiences. There are 5 main types of learned behaviors. We have the habituation, we have the imprinting, the conditioning, and it is comprised of an operant conditioning and the classical conditioning. Later on in this session we are going to learn what is the difference between them, and we have the cognitive behavior. Starting by the first type of learned behavior, which is the habituation. It comes from the word habit, which is when you get used to something. The habituation actually marks a decrease in a response to a repeated stimulus when it has no effect, when it has no positive or negative effects. We get used to something. For example, when someone calls your name for the first time and you turn back to find out that this person does not even talk to you. If he calls you many times, if he repeats this pattern many times and does the same action, you do not answer him because you got used to this action. This is a kind of behavior. We can say that you are habituated to this action. The first example that we are going to take is the birds in a nest. When birds in a nest, when objects starts falling beside the nest, the birds will react for the first time. But whenever they feel that this stimulus, which is, let's say, leaves falling beside the nest, when leaves will have no positive or negative action on, or positive or negative effect on birds, they will stop acting or will stop responding to it. And this will teach birds to focus on important stimuli instead of focusing on unimportant ones like leaves that are falling beside the nest. Another example is horses. Horses actually, they become habituated to noise in streets. If we put them in streets for the first time, horses will act to it and will start running away. For the second time, if we repeat this action, and horses will find out that the noise will not have any effect on them, so they will get habituated to it. A third example of habituation, it is when we add a scarecrow in a field in which we have birds. Actually, when we add a scarecrow in a field, birds will fly away. But over time, when birds notice that this scarecrow has no positive or negative effect, it has no effect on it, they will get used to it and they will become habituated to it. This is concerning habituation, and as we have said, the habituation is not a kind of a response, it is a learning process. It allows animals to ignore unimportant stimuli and focus on important ones. Now concerning the conditioning, as we have said, we have two types of conditioning. We have the classical one and the operant one. What is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning, it is a normal reaction that an organism can do when there are two stimuli available. Let's take the example. The most known example of the classical conditioning is Pavlov experiment. Pavlov experiment, it relates two different stimuli to one reaction, which is the production of saliva in dogs. Pavlov reaction started when at first Pavlov gave normal food to dogs. When it gave normal food to dogs, he noticed that dogs started producing saliva. You can see here, when food was available, there was a production of saliva in dogs. But Pavlov then removed the food and start ringing a bell beside the dog. The dog didn't react. You can notice here that there is no production of saliva. Another experiment was done, but now Pavlov was ringing a bell while the dog was given food. So, because food was available, the dog started producing saliva. Then Pavlov removed the food another day, it's not at the same time, and another day Pavlov removed the food and started ringing the bell. He noticed that the dog started producing saliva. He related then that the production of saliva can be done by relating food to the bell that is rang beside the dog. So as a result, the dog learned to relate the availability of food with the bell. That's why it acted in this way. Another type of conditioning is the operant conditioning, which is the learning process but by trial and error, or by punishment or reward. For example, we can do an action and we get punished to it, so we do not do it anymore. Or we can do an action and we get rewarded to it, so we get a reward from it, so that's why we can do it again. The animal could identify the right behavior if it gets a reward. For example, the blue jay bird, you can see here in this image, the blue jay bird eating the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly, actually it is a poisonous butterfly. When the bird eats the butterfly, it will start vomiting until the butterfly moves out. This will teach the bird to avoid this butterfly in future conditions. Another example, which is an experiment done by a scientist called Skinner, it is an example of an operant conditioning. We are going to explain what is the Skinner's experiment. Skinner experiment allowed us to identify how consequences affect future's behaviors. Skinner's box was comprised of, you can see here, this is the Skinner box. Skinner box was comprised of a lever. It is comprised of two signal lights, one that turns a red light on and one that turns a blue light on, and we have at the base here, we have an electric grid that gives powerful electric shocks to the rat. The experiment was done on rats. The lever was first connected to a container that has food. At first, the action of the rat was random. Whenever it pushes this lever while the blue light is on, pay attention that the first experiment done is when the rat pushes or presses on the lever. When the blue light is on, food started to flow and then the rat will be able to eat. So the rat over time, by repeating this action, learned that pushing the lever while the blue light is on, that means availability of food. Now Skinner started to turn on the red light. He turned off the blue light and he turned on the red light prior to giving an electric shock through the electric grid available here at the base. Whenever the red light is on, there was an electric field available here on the base, and the rat was given an electric shock. The rat later on learned that pressing the lever will switch off the electric field and the electric shock will be removed. Then he related, by repeating this action, he related the availability of the red light to the electric field and the lever together. So at the end, the rat learned that in order to eat, it can eat only by pressing the lever while the blue light is on. When the blue light turns off, that means, and the red light is on, that means the lever, pressing the lever, will switch off the electric field available. And for sure, this learning behavior in rats was gained by many trials and errors. So we are going to talk now about the imprinting process. Imprinting, it is the learning that can only occur within a specific time period in an animal's life, and it is permanent. The time during which an animal imprints is called the sensitive period. In some animals, the sensitive period occurs immediately after birth. For example, newborn offspring can form a strong bond with another animal, such as parent, during this time. Some animals, such as the whooping crane, for example, whooping cranes form a social attachment to the first object that they see after birth. Other animals, such as salmon, for example, they make imprinting process with chemicals in water. They can imprint with the chemicals in the place in which they hatched, and they can go back or turn back to this place when they want to lay eggs in the second time. Evidence of the influence of genetics on imprinting comes from experiments with the newly hatched birds. In nature, the first object the offspring sees most likely to be the parent. This ensures that the offspring will be nurtured by its parent. Nurturing behavior, we are going to learn what is nurturing behavior later. Actually, new experiments show that newly hatched whooping cranes were imprinting on the first object they see, whether it is an animal, a human, or any object like a box. And this was the main reason to maintain an experiment in 1999 just to prevent the extinction process of whooping cranes. Scientists have used a kind of an ultralight plane in order to change the migratory behavior of 180 whooping cranes. Actually, the whooping cranes, whenever they have hatched, the scientists have used the ultralight plane. That was the first object seen by cranes. Cranes started following it in order to change the migratory pattern, and they succeeded in their migration to another place. And since that time, the method was applied every year in order to maintain in order to prevent actually the migratory behavior of cranes. The last example of learned behavior, it is the cognitive behavior, which is the ability to maintain thinking, reasoning, and processing information. I'll give you an example, which is whenever you want to solve a problem, you are using your cognitive behavior because you are analyzing, you are using a specific ways you have learned at school in order to solve this problem. For example, in this image you can see how the chimpanzee use its cognitive behavior by using rocks in order to break nuts. It has to learn how to use the rocks in order to break the nut. For example, monkeys, in order to climb trees, they have to learn how to do this process. So they use or they analyze before doing this. Humans, for example, we said by solving problems, they use their cognitive behaviors. Another example is when organisms try to find food in specific places. They have to analyze and to use, they have to think in order to get food from specific places. This is concerning everything about innate and learned behaviors. So we are going just to make a quick summary of this lesson. We said that a behavior, mainly a behavior, it is a kind of a response to a specific stimulus, and you have to learn that these stimuli that we are talking about, they have to be species specific. That means a stimulus has to be specific for certain individuals. We have two types of behaviors. We have an innate behavior that is influenced by genes only, and we have the learned behavior that is influenced by genes and experiences at the same time. An example of the innate behavior, we took the fixed action pattern, which is the same repeated actions taken by organisms to perform specific behaviors. We have examples of learned behaviors. We have the habituation, which is to get used to something. We have the classical conditioning, which is to relate two different stimuli together to obtain one behavior. We have an operant conditioning. We have an example of operant conditioning. We have the Skinner's box experiment, and an example of classical conditioning. We have the Pavlov's experiment. We have the imprinting process, which is to follow the first organism that newly hatched organism see. And we have the cognitive behavior, which is the use of thinking and reasoning and processing information in order to solve problems or complex concepts.